Oh, admit.
Yeah.
Okay, that's done.
Okay, I'll admit everybody.
Excellent.
Mute. Yeah, go on.
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. Rather hoping you can hear me. Welcome.
Yes.
The second of.
Well, when it all started, I got my flasks out because my sound got. But you didn't know. I said, what's on it? I said, got my flasks out. I boiled them.
Could I ask everybody to please mute? Did you catch my introduction? Sorry, I'm losing this.
John, I muted you along with those other people, so you're unmuted now.
I will start again. Okay, thanks very much. So, good evening. For those who weren't at the first of Richard's history talks, I'm John Sharp. I'm the chair of Friends of Wanstead Parklands. Welcome to Richard's second talk on the series of the history of Wanstead Park. For just a little note again on the protocol, I would ask you to make sure you are muted throughout the talk. Secondly, if you can turn your video off, it helps us with the bandwidth. And thirdly, in terms of questions, please use the chat function and Richard will pick up all of the questions at the end of the talk. I don't think I have to give Richard too much more of an introduction than I gave him last time. Everybody who was at the talk would recognise the extent of Richard's knowledge, and I hope very much enjoyed the information that you learnt from it. Without further ado, I will hand over to Richard, who will probably take a few seconds to share his screen, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Right. I hope everyone can see that. Right, as you've heard, I'm Richard Arnopp. I'm a member of the Friends of Wanstead Parklands Committee, and I would like to second John in welcoming you all here this evening. This is the second in my series of talks on Wanstead Park. And tonight I'm going to be covering the vast expanse of time that we call prehistory. I've given this session the title In the Beginning, but for our purposes today, I'm not starting at the creation of the world, but at the development of the landscape as we know it. Then I'm going to look at the successive waves of human settlement which shaped it prior to the Roman invasion, and highlight some of the traces that they have left behind. If you missed the first talk, that and all subsequent episodes will be available on a dedicated YouTube channel, and I will post the web address in the chat at the end. So, Wanstead Park is located on a low ridge between the rivers Lee and Roding, which are in turn tributaries of the Thames. The Thames is the defining feature of the whole area, as we'll discuss. It's near the southern end of Epping Forest, which roughly follows the crest of the ridge for a distance of about 12 miles. The ground slopes gently down to the south toward the Thames, forming a series of terraces. In the vicinity of the Roding, which sits in a fairly large valley of its own, the ground also slopes toward the river, fairly steeply in places. The Roding Valley is also punctuated by a succession of minor valleys, some still with active streams, such as the Cranbrook, which is nearly opposite Wanstead Park, and others now dry. The gentle rolling landscape, still clad in the Wanstead area by substantial patches of deciduous woodland and heath, is deceptive. Some of the world's landscapes are very old. The Amazon rainforest, for example, has been there in recognizable form for about 10 million years. However, the Britain we know has existed for only a few millennia. Under its verdant disguise lies a fossilized landscape, which was the product of a very different world, and one in which this country was much less hospitable than it is now. This formative period was the Quaternary Ice Age. The latest of 5 major such episodes in the Earth's history. I'll get to that in a moment in the context of a brief discussion of the local geology. The London Basin formed as a result of tectonic movements related to the formation of the Alps 40 to 60 million years ago. The deepest geology in the basin that's really significant to us is a thick layer of chalk dating to the Cretaceous period and laid down about 88 to 85 million years ago. In the Wanstead area, it lies at a considerable depth, but although it's invisible locally, there are no outcrops around here, it's a vitally important aquifer or reservoir of fresh water. Sea levels were particularly high when the white chalk formed over 150 meters above the present sea level. At this time, there was no ice at the poles and warm surface sea temperatures. What's now southern England lay beneath warm, shallow sea. The chalk formed at depths of 1 to 300 meters and contains few impurities from river sediments due to arid conditions on the nearest land at that time. The level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was high, creating ideal conditions for algae to bloom and create massive quantities of sediment and an ooze rich in calcium carbonate, which was later compressed to form the chalk. For the last 56 million years, the London Basin has been accumulating sediments such as clay, gravel, and sand. Initially, these were mostly laid down in shallow coastal seas, covering the area where London now stands. The next major sequence above the chalk is the London clay, which formed approximately 56 to 48 million years ago in the Paleogene period. It was deposited in a sea up to 200 meters deep, which became first shallower, then deeper again in a cycle that repeated 5 times. I'm going to take you onto a geological map. The London clay is the purplish grey area that you can see in the upper part of the map. So each time, coarser material, including some pebbles, was succeeded by clay, and the clay then becomes increasingly sandy. This cyclical deposition indicates changing sea levels and a fluctuating climate. Unlike the chalk, the London clay forms large outcrops across the Wanstead area, as we've seen. Now, the Quaternary Ice Age, which is the foundational event for what we can see in the area, began about 2.6 million years ago. I say began because it isn't over. The current warm period, known as the Holocene, began about 11,500 years ago and merely represents the latest in a series of interglacial periods which have punctuated the continuing ice age. One day the ice will be back. It's thought to be unlikely to be for another 50,000 years or so, so there's no immediate reason to panic. There were many periods of glaciation over Britain, the largest about 450,000 years ago being known as the Anglian, and the latest the Devensian. You can see that the Anglian reached almost down to the present route of the Thames, almost but not quite. The Thames at the time of the Anglian glaciation was flowing between St Albans and Chelmsford and left the present English coast at Haysborough in Norfolk. Sorry. That was the old route of the Thames. A lake occupied the old Thames Valley when the river was blocked by ice at St Albans. The lake overflowed and the water found a route towards Uxbridge and Richmond and then migrated to reach its present route, thus shaping the entire Thames Valley as we know it. Low sea levels during the glacial maximum meant that much of what's now the North Sea was dry land, and the British Isles were joined to continental Europe. It was during the Quaternary that humans joined our geological record. In only the last few years, as you may have seen in the media, footprints were found eroding out of the seashore in Norfolk from over 800,000 years ago. It's believed that there were 10 attempted colonizations by 4 different human species over the last million years, of which we are the latest. Gravel deposits tell the story of where the River Thames flowed at different times. There are many different types of gravel in our region, which between them record the history of the Thames from its earliest origins to the present day. The gravels were laid down in a cold climate when the Thames was a braided river carrying very large volumes of water compared to today. There are 3 major local deposits shown on our map. These are the Boyne Hill gravels, which are shown in pink, the Lynch Hill gravels shown in dark orange, and the Hackney gravels, mostly under Wanstead Flats, which are shown in light orange. Head deposits are shown in dark pink, and riverine alluvium along the Roding Valley in pale green. The topography and geology of the Wanstead area are going to feature in our story in one way or another at various times, as they affected land use, the layout of the later park, and that perennial headache over the last 300 years, the water supply. So although I'm moving on now, you will be hearing more of this in later sessions. Before we turn to the history of Holocene human colonization, let's have a quick look at the history of how the animal life in this area changed over the wildly fluctuating conditions of the latter part of the Ice Age. In the Victorian period, gravel quarrying and excavations for other reasons brought to light some spectacular fossils in Ilford, some of which are on display at the Natural History Museum and the Museum of London to this day. This is a mammoth skull, and this is an aurochs. The aurochs was a gigantic species of wild cattle. They survived in the forests of Eastern Europe on the border between present-day Poland and Belarus until the 1620s, though they became extinct in this country in the Bronze Age. Sadly, they got caught up in the events of the 30 Years' War, and the last of them were eaten by soldiers. But they once lived in Ilford. These excavations also reveal scatterings of Paleolithic human artifacts from Wanstead, Lake House Estate, Aldersbrook, and some of these are now at the British Museum, the Cambridge Museum, and the Ashmolean Museum. The last interglacial, the last major interglacial before our own, known as the Ipswichian, had temperate conditions with somewhat higher summer temperatures than we're used to now. The mammalian fauna at that time included fallow deer, bison, straight-tusked elephant, narrow-nosed rhinoceros, and hippopotamus, not things that we're used to seeing nowadays. The early Devensian cold phase, which followed, left Britain with no known mammals at all. The next mild phase brought recolonisation by most of these species familiar from the Ipswichian, with the exception of the hippopotamus, for whom it wasn't quite warm enough this time round. In the final part of the early Devensian, Britain had a limited group of cold maritime species indicative of high snow cover. Biodiversity was low, with only reindeer and bison being represented in any great numbers. The major predator was a brown bear of exceptionally large body size. It was about the size of a modern polar bear. By the middle Devensian of 65 to 25,000 years ago, the climate again became milder, with an environment which is often referred to as the mammoth steppe. Reindeer and bison were still present, but the fauna was dominated by woolly mammoth, as we've seen, woolly rhinoceros, horse, and spotted hyena. This period also witnessed the reappearance in Britain of Neanderthal people after an absence of about 100,000 years, and their subsequent replacement by modern humans. Although Neanderthals disappeared as a separate species about 40,000 years ago, for reasons which are still not clear, it's now known that most people outside sub-Saharan Africa carry some Neanderthal DNA from limited interbreeding between modern humans and them. I personally have a little less than 2% Neanderthal ancestry, slightly less than most people. Although the warmest part of the last glaciation, the middle Devensian was characterized by a number of abrupt climate oscillations, which probably contributed to many of the Pleistocene megafauna beginning to go extinct. Animals can adapt to a lot, but they need time, and they didn't always get it. The climatic switches could be very, very rapid indeed. In a few tens of years, it's thought nowadays. The dramatic climatic deterioration of the last glacial maximum about 22,000 years ago, and that's the Devensian, which you saw on the map, was marked once again by a restricted fauna, including reindeer, woolly mammoth, and muskox. Later, there was a brief return to a more temperate fauna, this time with wild horse, red deer, mountain hare, antelope, red deer, elk, and modern humans. birch woodland spread before the final climatic deterioration of the Younger Dryas, which brought about the return of reindeer, Arctic fox, and other cold climate species. The warming of the Holocene 11,500 years ago and the spread of woodland led to the formation of Britain's modern mammal fauna, though there have since been losses, including aurochs, as I mentioned, which disappeared in the Bronze Age, bears. It's not certain when native bears disappeared, but they may have survived in Scotland into historic times just about, but we're not sure. Beavers and wolves. Wolves survived both in Scotland and Ireland into the 18th century. All of these were due to human persecution. So we've covered the development of the landscape and touched on the extraordinary changes in Britain's fauna brought about by fluctuations in climate. Now let's take a look at human settlement during the Holocene. The first short-term human settlers during the present interglacial belong to the Upper Paleolithic Ahrensburg culture. Those people were few in numbers and hunter-gatherers who were heavily dependent on reindeer. They were followed by Mesolithic people from Europe who arrived about 11,000 years ago. They had a more sophisticated technology, and though also hunter-gatherers, were less completely nomadic. They created long-term settlements in places where food was abundant. Though they weren't farmers in the full sense, they may have grown some foods or encouraged natural food sources, and they certainly began to manage the landscape more actively than previous human groups. And it's with them that the permanent occupation of the British Isles began. By modern standards, their populations were astonishingly small. It's suggested that Great Britain may have had a maximum of about 20 to 30,000 inhabitants, and Ireland, which is ecologically more impoverished with, at that time, no large animals, no more than about 2,000. It was also in the Mesolithic, about 8,100 years ago, that Britain finally became an island as sea levels rebounded after the retreat of the ice. Mesolithic artifacts have been found in Overton Drive in an area which was once part of Wanstead Park. The Mesolithic ended about 6,300 years ago with the arrival of farming and a new era known as the Neolithic, which lasted from 6,300 to 4,200 years before the present. The Middle Neolithic was characterized by the building of enormous monuments for purposes and in a cultural and organizational context, which we can only guess at. That's Silbury Hill, which is also in Wiltshire. The later Neolithic saw cultural changes which seem to have been associated with a new wave of settlement. Now, Neolithic artifacts have been found in Wanstead Park and in excavations in Cambridge Park, just north of the park, what's now Eastern Avenue. The continuation of Eastern Avenue. The Bronze Age, with the development of a metal-based technology, was associated with further cultural changes, exemplified by the distinctive beaker style of pottery, though that began to be used a couple of centuries before metals began to be used. That period can be subdivided into an earlier phase from 2,300, well, 4,000 to be consistent, 4,300 to 3,200 years before the present, and a later one, 3,200 to 2,750 years before the present. A Bronze Age axe was found in Belgrave Road. This is not it, but this is something comparable, and an arrowhead in the Heronry Pond when work was being done on it in the early 20th century. The Iron Age was said to have begun about 750 BC, though there wasn't much iron in evidence to begin with, and in most of Britain, the Iron Age is normally regarded as ending in 43 AD with the Roman invasion. Parts of the British Isles, which were never occupied by the Romans, make things a little more complicated. But for our purposes, the Iron Age ended in 43 AD. The ironworking technology is associated with Celtic culture, and probably a common Brythonic language, which was used right across the island as far as we can tell. A number of shards of late Bronze Age or early Iron Age pottery were found in Wanstead Park in excavations in 2008 to 9, some of which were associated with buried ditches, which appeared to be of that period. The nature of the site isn't clear, but two things make it seem interesting and worthy of further investigation. Firstly, in 1746, the owner of Aldersbrook House, Smart Letellier, mentioned that in Wanstead Park had been found the fragments of several urns of different colours, but of the coarsest earth, which he assumed to have been Roman as they've been found near remains of a Roman building. However, as it's now been confirmed that there was prehistoric activity in the same general area, he might have witnessed the discovery of a prehistoric cemetery. Secondly, a very important late Iron Age and early Bronze Age site, it existed on the Ilford side of the Roding at Uphall Camp. This prehistoric site was more than a mile in circumference with an internal area of 48 acres. The archaeologist Pamela Greenwood told us that not only was it the largest recorded hill fort in Essex, but that it compared in size with Maiden Castle in Dorset. Now sadly destroyed, it was at least thoroughly investigated and forms the basis of a display at the Museum of London, complete with a reconstruction. This raises a possibility that Wanstead Park had some kind of satellite settlement or ritual centre or whatever linked to Uphall Camp. I'll be discussing all this further in my fourth talk, which will be breaking the chronological sequence to talk about the history of archaeological investigation in and around Wanstead Park, what it's told us and what we still need to find out. Now, I've outlined very briefly and in very general terms 9,000 years of quite radical cultural changes. Hunting and gathering gave way to settled societies based on agriculture, technologies based on stone and organic materials, to technologies based on metals. And the obvious question is, how did this happen? Was it a case of old dogs learning new tricks as a result of trade, immigration, and peaceful assimilation? Or was it something else? Thanks to the new technology of genetic analysis, we can start to answer this with a degree of confidence. In only a couple of decades, the British Isles have become one of the best genetic laboratories in the world, in large part because of the interest that we and our American cousins have in genealogy. The result is that we know the genetics of the British from the earliest inhabitants after the retreat of the ice sheets down to the modern period, to a degree unrivaled in any other region on the planet. We can now trace this history from the arrival of hunter-gatherers at the end of the last ice age 12,000 years ago, to the Neolithic people that left us 5,000-year-old monuments like Stonehenge, and through the Bronze and Iron Ages that followed, all the way through the so-called Dark Ages after Britain left the Roman orbit 1,600 years ago. We now know that the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons was only the last in the long process of what the Germans call Völkerwanderung, the wandering of peoples. The ancient DNA record is not entirely a vision of Britain as a genetic layer cake of successive waves of people, not completely. Ancient DNA has also yielded the darker finding that the earliest prehistoric migrations sometimes involved more or less stark replacement, marked by overnight cultural change and the apparent wholesale extinction of predecessor groups. With later migrations, that tendency was less marked, with progressively more cultural synthesis and diminishing degrees of genetic change. So, for example, the genetic composition of present-day indigenous British people is still about 60% pre-Anglo-Saxon. So, contrary to archaeologists' assumptions, as recently as 20 years ago, the genetic legacy of Ice Age foragers in the ancestry of modern Britons is nearly non-existent. Indeed, the earliest settlers were subsequently almost totally replaced, or at least swamped, by Neolithic farmers from the Mediterranean nearly 6,000 years ago. Then, 4,500 years ago, those farmers in turn saw themselves supplanted by a group saddled with the name of Bell Beaker people, or just Beaker people, from the bell-shaped urns by which we first identified them. Genetically similar to contemporary North Europeans, the Bell Beaker migrants accounted for 90% of the male line ancestry of the British population by 2000 BC, with the Neolithic proportion dropping to 10% in 5 centuries. But the same methods now show us that not even these were the last invaders that made a massive demographic impact, changing the genetic character of the population. During the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, about 1000 BC, yet another wave of migrants, distantly related to the Beakers, arrived from mainland Europe. These were the people who in their turn were to be conquered by the Romans, who are our main informants about what they were like. So I'll talk about them more next month. Thank you very much. And I'll now take any questions you may have.
Richard, while everybody else might be thinking, you mentioned your 2% Neanderthal content. Exactly how did you come across the number?
Well, I've had my DNA analysed. I did that for personal reasons, because there is a fairly recent gap in my family tree due to illegitimacy. I got myself analysed, and that was the figure they came up with for archaic human ancestry.
All right, thank you very much.
So There are no questions.
It appears not. Well,
Well, I'm sorry that some of it was a bit technical. I hope I haven't bored you all to death, but I think we need to understand how the landscape was formed, and something about the early archaeology of the this part of the country, to the extent that it shows up in this area.
Richard, I don't think you need to be concerned. It was, I thought it was exceedingly interesting talk, and I'm hoping everybody else did. There is another question just arrived, so I'll pass it back over to you.
Yes, Adrian Russell asks, were there any Iron Age homesteads in Wanstead Park? If there were, we haven't found them. I have found evidence using LiDAR of a possible circular enclosure in the middle of the plain, which is the grassy area north of the lakes. But it hasn't been archaeologically investigated or even its existence verified. That could be the location of the village if there was one. What seems most likely to have been found so far is not a settlement, but a cemetery. But of course, if there was a cemetery, it does seem to suggest that there were people living not too far away, but we've yet to find them. What was discovered in Overton Drive, that was some flint tools which were assumed to be Mesolithic. So we've got someone here who's got a bit more Neanderthal in them than me. The mammoth, I think the mammoth tusk was found at Uphall. There were animal bones found in the vicinity of Uphall and in Uphall Lane. I'm not sure if that one was. Uphall Camp was, if I can go back to the beginning, right, this is the map of the area. Uphall Camp was just above the east-west railway line. So it was on the boundary of Ilford and Barking, I believe. And is that it? Any more questions?
No, I'm not seeing any more questions, Richard. So
I think we're done.
On behalf of everybody.
Someone says Uphall Camp was off Ilford Lane. I went to Uphall School. Okay, that's fair enough. It was preserved until the end of the 19th century. It consisted of the prehistoric Diction Bank enclosure with a mount at one end, which was believed to be, it was called the Lavender Mount, which probably belonged to an old windmill. But sadly, bit by bit, it was nibbled away by industry, and then eventually the entire area was built over with houses. The next talk will be on the 24th of March, and it will be on the Roman period. The one after that, I'll be dealing with archaeology as a subject from the 18th century up to the present day. So that will be number 4.
Richard, there's a question earlier that from Tim Cousins, who asks, does Essex/Redbridge have an HAR, historical archaeology record?
Yes, it does. It's part of the Greater London archaeological record. In fact, I skimmed through it when I was preparing this talk to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything important. So, gone. Oh, could you tell us a bit more about the Ilford Mammoth? Not that one specifically, but when gravel quarries were being dug in the 19th century, and also when the railway cutting at Ilford was being opened up, large quantities of fossilized animal bones from the Ice Ages were discovered. And that's all I can tell you. Well, Iron Age people were cattle herders, someone says. Yes, it's Tricia. Yes, they were cattle herders. They practiced mixed farming, so they grew corn as well. The more gravelly areas would have been suitable for growing crops, whereas the clay soils, which at that time, because of the technology they had, were difficult to exploit, would have been used for grazing or cattle or pigs.
I think, Richard, it looks like we're going, and perhaps gone this time.
Okay.
So, thank you once again.
I hope to see you all next time.
Indeed. Okay, I will end the meeting now. Thanks a lot. And thank you to everybody for attending, of course.